The Library Channel is proud to present the 5th installment of the Simon Ortiz and the Labriola Center Lecture on Indigenous Land, Culture, and Community. Sponsored by the ASU American Indian Studies Program, ASU Department of English, ASU American Indian Policy Institute, ASU Labriola Center, and the Heard Museum. Recorded on October 7th, 2010, at the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Simon Ortiz opens the program.
Hello, I hope everybody is well this evening. Because that is what we want and need. To live actually good and comfortable days. And it's important that we gather to share with each other the days that we have spent, whether it's in Phoenix or in New York City or in the rural homelands that a lot of us come from, or here in Tempe, for example. I live in Tempe, of course, right now, as I teach at ASU. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating by coming here to the lecture series that I'm a coordinator of. But all of us really are part of the lecture series because it is from our midst that really our voices rise. And of course the speakers in some instances come from our home communities or else from elsewhere. As Dr. Shanley is from Montana. I want to introduce her by speaking about some things that are very noteworthy. Dr. Kathryn Shanley teaches in Native American Studies at the University of Montana and serves as special assistant to the provost for Native American and Indigenous education. An enrolled member of the Fort Peck Assiniboine Nakolda tribe, Dr. Shanley grew up on the reservation. Her research interests include the work of James Welch, Blackfeet Grovant writer, and work on gender issues and in Indigenous studies, Native American religious autobiography, and Indigenous knowledge-based theory. She is also the University of Montana project director for a collaboration with the Asami Studies Center at the University of Tromsø, Norway, and also collaborates with faculty in Maori studies at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Dr. Shanley serves as the Ford Foundation Diversity Fellowship Regional Liaison and on boards for the National Academy of Sciences Fellowship, the Executive Committee of the Modern Language Association, Division of American Indian Literatures, and for 8 years now, the American Indian Graduate Center. Recognition of her leadership extends to her inclusion in notable Native Americans and the Dictionary of American Indian Women. Before coming to the University of Montana in 1999 to become the first chair of Native American Studies, Dr. Shanley previously held positions at Cornell University and the University of Washington. As chair of NAS at University of Montana, she has worked for 7 years to raise funds for a new American center, which was dedicated in May 2010, which earlier today she really informed us about in a very, very vivid manuscript about how that New American Center was planned, designed, and then money raised for and erected, something that I think that ASU certainly needs and the city of Phoenix can certainly be supportive of. Well, those are facts that I have recited about Dr. Shanley. But Kate, as I know her by, is one of our really, I think, significant and special indigenous persons who, with her knowledge and understanding and compassion, brings, concerns and issues before us, puts them in our forefront. And that's why I value, a person like Dr. Shanley, to remind us that we are constantly faced with challenges that must be addressed, Dr. Shanley is also the incoming president of NASA, which is the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, which is, I feel, a positive effort that we must somehow bring to the correct direction, that our indigenous grassroots people can rely upon, and as well as for those of us who are scholars and academics and creative people, so that according to our Nanatitra, Papa Atitra, our grandfathers and our grandmothers, that we fulfill the promise that we would always live in a good way. So with those words, I really do want to welcome Dr. Kathryn, or Kate Shanley, and have her meet you. Please, Kate.
Thank you for that marvelous introduction. As I said to the faculty at, as I said to the faculty at lunch, Simon has always been one of my heroes, and the reasons for that are deep. They have to do with the fact that we come from different places, certainly different Native communities, but we both understand that the battles and struggles to be fought are on many spheres, and many of them require writing, and we value the writing that academics do as much as we value the writing that creative writers do. But besides that, his work has been an example to me, and I especially love his book, After and Before the Lightning, because of its ceremonial center and it being the plains. We celebrate, there are particular types of cultural practices that only happen after the last thunder, lightning, and before the next one. And that's something on the plains that you become very aware of in your daily life. It's not just an abstract principle that you put up on a PowerPoint in a class. It's something very deep to your soul. It has to do with rootedness to place. So thank you, Simon. He's been a marvelous guide and help to me. And thank you to Arizona State Native American Indian Studies and the Heard Museum for all the work the staff have done to bring this about. I greatly appreciate it. And lastly, I'd like to thank my family who came out in relatively great numbers. And I was telling the faculty today at lunch that when I was on the airplane, there was, in the airplane magazine, there was this wonderful quote, which was, "It's wonderful to have a family that is close, loving, and supporting, living in another city." And so my family often, many of them live down here. I've entitled this talk, Mapping Indigenous Futures, Creating a Native Voice in Higher Education. I'd like to begin with an epigraph. It comes from Black Elk Speaks. And then for just a little while, I thought I saw beneath the flowering tree, in the shade, the circled village of people, and every living thing with roots or legs or wings, and all were happy. Quote, "The flowering tree shall stand in the center of the nation's circle," said the grandfather. A cane to walk with, and a people's heart, and by your powers you shall make it blossom. Tonight I'll talk first about the significance of global indigenous people's struggles to gain recognition and control over their own destinies, why that struggle is important to us here in Arizona tonight. Second, using the example of Montana's Indian Ed for All Act mandate, I will discuss indigenous educational models and strategies in higher education for realizing the rights laid out in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This is a slide of Asami Village. And Asami are indigenous people to Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And so they span the circumpolar north. And these are, of course, the Northern Lights. And I chose this to open, to talk about, I find it wonderful. One of my students asked me one time when I taught the book, Papago Woman, why would people live in the desert like that? And people live as a people, and they live where they live and develop a way to live there. It's about being a people together and then negotiating their living with the land. And so when I saw this, I thought of how it looked like plains, and yet it's such a different place. And I wanted to remind us of indigeneity everywhere and its connectedness. In our everyday speech, we frequently employ the metaphor of mapping to frame our ways of thinking about everything from how we're going to spend the day to how we imagine our future lives. The metaphor of the map in regard to our time and thoughts configures their only home ground. In that sense, we are what we imagine. In America and other parts of the world, the real business of mapping, or should I say the business of real mapping, given the rapacious global capitalist enterprise, that is the dividing up of space and assigning ownership, is captured in the dichotomous constructions, civilization and wilderness, developed and underdeveloped or undeveloped, and first and third worlds. When used in the context of indigenous peoples' rights, mapping, and I'm using it in quotations, represents both an abstract notion of full peoplehood and the boundaries of literal homelands. The political control, which frequently remains contested. With the United Nations vote of 143 to 4, with 11 abstentions and 4 against, recognizing that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on September 13, 2007, Indigenous people around the world made their way onto the metaphorical map of global recognition of their humanity. Indigenous peoples' human rights have conspicuously been ignored since the UN passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was in 1948, after World War II. According to a press release by the leadership of the United Nations after the passing of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the document, quote, represents the dynamic development of international legal norms and reflects the commitment of the UN membership states to move in certain directions. This is a picture of Indigenous people from around the world celebrating International Day, World Indigenous People, at the UN in August. Originally lacking endorsement by the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, passage of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People nonetheless represents a symbolic milestone, a movement toward social justice. The International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs in the UN asserts that 370 million Indigenous people of the world are, quote, the most impoverished, marginalized, and frequently victimized people in the world. Over the last several decades, but especially since 2007 signing of the Declaration, the term Indigenous, when applied to root peoples, has grown in usage. Indigenous as a human rights movement represents a revolt of sorts, a resistance to, quote, the forces of cultural uniformity and against the appropriation of Indigenous peoples' sovereignty by states. According to Ron Neeson, author of The Origins of Indigeneity, the movement results from resistance to colonialism. He writes, the main premise is that by removing Indigenous people from their land, educating their children in state schools, eliminating their languages, and usurping their own systems of justice and conflict resolution, states are imposing a gray uniformity on all humanity, stifling and suppressing the creative cultural energies of those who are most knowledgeable and prescient about the forces of nature. I actually read somewhere that the biodiversity in the world, something like 90% of it exists on Indigenous peoples' lands. And the same is true of ethnodiversity. So when Ron Neeson uses the word gray uniformity, I think it ought to be of concern to everyone about the view of humanity, not destroying that rich variety of experience. So closeness to nature becomes the ethical hinge pin for arguing to preserve racial and ethnic minority people's rights in light of current global climate change. What Derek Bell terms interest convergence in describing the civil rights movement. That is, dominant powers seeing a self-interest that coexists with the needs of the oppressed. Derek Bell is a lawyer. He's on the law faculty at Harvard and is quite outspoken in critical legal theory about civil rights was where his work began. So when he uses the term interest convergence, I think, though, that it's worth hanging on to as a term. Moving beyond interest convergence toward historical reckoning of and accountability for past actions will of necessity involve deepening understandings of the power of place in shaping human consciousness in community and a commitment to ethical engagement. The Declaration links tribal people across the globe both through their shared history of colonial domination and their fundamentally place and kinship-based worldviews. With a recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights on the part of the UN will be allowed to play itself out in the form of control over natural resources as well as land ownership and self-determination, however, remains to be seen. Nevertheless, the merging of the metaphorical and the literal in the Declaration signals a crucial moment and a crucial movement away from another aspect of the Western binary thinking that has trapped Indigenous people in the natural or the wilderness for 5 centuries or more. The idea that they have no place in the future. And I have quotations around place because what I'm thinking there is of when you literally do not allow people to exist even though they exist in front of you, when they're not even on the metaphorical map, then they disappear. And they literally start to disappear. So place in that sense is very important. Domination and exploitation of Indigenous people and what is commonly referred to as, quote, the environment, go hand in hand. I will offer a brief overview of the Declaration and situate it within the North American context. First, made up of 19 introductory paragraphs and 45 articles, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People covers, quote, covers a wide range of human rights and fundamental freedoms related to Indigenous people, including the right to preserve and develop their cultural characteristics and distinct identities, ownership and use of traditional lands and natural resources, and protection against genocide. Isn't it astonishing that Indigenous people were not included in the protection against genocide in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights? So Asian Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Network on July 2006 is the source of that information. The Declaration also covers rights related to religion, language, and education, and the right to participate in political, economic, and social life in the society in which the people live, end quote. The most controversial aspect of the Declaration, and perhaps the reason 4 nations would not initially sign, quote, it recognizes the right to self-determination, to self-government in matters related to Indigenous affairs, and the honoring of treaties and agreements concluded with Indigenous people, end quote. So why is the Declaration so important? Even though the United States does not recognize its validity. In symbolic terms, Indigenous people and the ways in which they are treated should no longer be hidden behind or within the discourse of colonialism. That is, that they're slated to disappear, that their cultures are going to evolve out of indigeneity into modern life, or all those other things attached to the word primitive. Whether that discourse takes the form of scientific, political, or popular cultural media. With this declaration, the first step in truth and reconciliation has been made, an acknowledgement of the need for social justice for Indigenous peoples and for empowerment. Since Nuremberg, World War II, and beginning with South Africa after apartheid, at least 30 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been set up around the world. Most notably for us tonight are those commissions seeking redress for the atrocities of forced boarding school education in North America. The Asian Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Network details this by saying, quote, "From denial of entry to the League of Nations to the adoption of the draft declaration to exclusion from the, quote, we the people of the United Nations of the Charter of the United Nations, Indigenous people had to consistently overcome exclusion. International human rights instruments failed to include Indigenous people. Critical Indigenous rights are not found in normative legal framework. They were not on the world map in the minds of UN ambassadors and had no recourse in regard to international human remedies." You know, when you do many drafts of a talk, sometimes you wonder if you took something out and forgot to put it back in. So I'll just say at this point that of the 4 that initially refused or voted against the declaration, Canada, New Zealand, and Arizona have since endorsed it. We're now just waiting for the Obama administration. And at the end of the first week in November, we're having a conference at the University of Montana, and Alan Parker, who is Cree from Rocky Boy, is going to come and talk about the resolution he presented to the National Congress of American Indians about endorsing the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. So we're going to have a big discussion about it, but the National Congress of American Indians is going to advise the president on moving forward, which I think is very positive. Now that James Anaya, author of Indigenous People in International Law, was recently appointed to serve as UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights and fundamental freedom of Indigenous people, North America's Indigenous people find their place in that world political body, if not legally, symbolically. He used to teach at the University of Arizona. In his book, Anaya details the evolution of Western thought relative to Indigenous people in North America since the European invasion of the continent. Bartolomé de Las Casas and Francisco de Vitoria of the late 15th and early 16th centuries regarded native people to be human, which was no small matter at the time. Anaya writes that within the historical jurisprudential frame, the threshold question for determining the rights and status of the American Indians was whether they were rational human beings, end quote. Over the next 2 centuries, Western thinking evolved a differentiation between, quote, the natural rights of individuals and the natural rights of states that allowed for the domination of people by the state for, quote, the common good. Under the Bush administration, I'm not sure if people realize this, but what we commonly refer to as the law of eminent domain, where the government can come in and take your property if they feel that they have to build a freeway there or that kind of thing. Under the Bush administration, that right was extended so that they can take your property if it's an obstacle to economic development. That is the equivalent to declaring corporations persons, it creates a different law than most of us think of as American law. It means that some entrepreneur can push a politician and take your property if they think a mall on that particular site would benefit it. So the notion of the greater good that the native people of this land have suffered under has now been extended to everyone. Aren't we lucky? So it's a kind of repression, oppression of rights that's important to highlight. So the natural rights of people were put against the natural rights of state. Vittoria had opened the door early on his writing on American Indians by seeing them as, quote, unfit to found or administer a lawful state, end quote. Therein lies the seeds of federal paternalism that continues to this day, as well as the implicit definition of the Western European nation state, an insidious discourse of dominance hides in the idea that the nation-state's rights trump the rights of the indigenous nations residing within. Military, political, economic, educational, and religious domination has followed. In the early decades of the 19th century, 3 Supreme Court decisions chiseled into law the idea of there being no tribal institutional equivalent to that of the nation state. Chief Justice Marshall wrote majority legal opinions amidst the controversy of removal of Cherokee and other southwestern Indian nations to Oklahoma. His deeming of Cherokees as, quote, quasi-sovereign domestic dependent nations removed them from international law, since, quote, tribal societies were seen as not qualifying as nations or states, and hence as without full rights to group autonomy or ancestral lands. So they're removed from international law at that point. They were ironically civilized enough, the southeastern tribes, to have developed a written language, produced a written literature and a newspaper through their printing press, formed their own Supreme Court, maintained successful farming and animal husbandry homesteads, and developed other modes of economic development. Their removal, which Cherokees termed the Trail of Tears, represented a historical moment of extreme social injustice in the United States. Although the Supreme Court opposed removal, the premises of Chief Justice Marshall's argument, quote, meant that tribes and other indigenous peoples, not qualifying as states, could not participate in the shaping of international law, nor could they look to it to affirm the rights that had once been deemed to inhere in them by natural or divine law. The act of signing treaties is itself, or should, serve as an indication of indigenous peoples' inherent rights, despite the doctrine of discovery, which is the legal fiction that decreed that European nation-states had the right to claim previously unexplored territories. We just saw that where Russia went up to the Arctic, or to Antarctica, and buried a flag down on the ocean floor to lay claim to that place, because they're thinking there will be oil there in the future. So the doctrine of discovery is this huge legal fiction that was created by European nations to facilitate colonialism. Robert Miller's just published a book on that topic, if you're interested. So today, in regard to the Cabell case, payment of court-ordered compensation for over 100 years of federal government failure in fulfilling its fiduciary responsibility to the plaintiffs, who are individual Indian account holders, the settlement is stymied in Congress. 14 years ago, the judgment was leveled. When in this country do we allow that to go on? In the popular cultural mind of any period of the removals from the Southeast, artistic endeavors also powerfully interpret and influence ongoing political happenings. Carrie Carpenter offers a poignant historical account in the opening of her book, Seeing Red: Anger, Sentimentality, and American Indians. She relates how the Cherokee leader, John Ross, is compelled to correct and protest an advertisement for a pre-performance enactment of, quote, a real Indian war dance, exhibiting hate, triumph, revenge, and so on. And it's a warm-up to a play, Pocahontas and the Settlers of Virginia, a national drama. The ad further promises that Ross himself will appear. He's a notorious person at this point because he's leading the Cherokees, and he's trying to prevent removal. So the cheap advertising trick represents co-optation at its most potent, for Ross has journeyed to Washington, D.C., quote, to protest the government's American Indian removal policies. Turning the volume up on American mainstream guilt, fascination, and fear at key moments drowns out the voices struggling so desperately to be heard in those early decades of the 19th century, and indeed many times since. Edward Said, in fact, argues that domination occurs in three spheres. One is the institutional, governmental, and one is the academic, educational, and the third is popular culture. And so when you look at, I do a lot of work in popular culture, so when you look at an historical happening, you need to look at what kinds of things are being written at the time, what's the most popular book, and so on, because all those things work together. So fast forward nearly 200 years, and we see the ways that dominant culture fears play out. Exclusion of indigenous peoples from previous international law, such as the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in the 1940s, entailed complicated nation-state fears of political loss of sovereignty in forming alliances. Paul Lauren, author of The Evolution of International Human Rights, points out the difficulty in such arguments at that time when he writes, an international guarantee of human rights by their very nature would impinge on the claimed prerogatives of national sovereignty and domestic jurisdiction. And he further explains, most of those imperial powers were military allies necessary for defeating common enemies and not at all inclined to surrender their possessions or their prerogatives of national sovereignty, end quote. Paul Lauren is a professor at the University of Montana in history. Darcy McNichol, noted Métis scholar, creative writer, and enrolled tribal member of on the Flathead Reservation, an advocate for American Indian rights, wrote in his 1973 text, he's writing about land claims that commission of the 1903, and he says, in Native American tribalism, quote, "The United States Court of Claims, in reviewing an Indian case at the end of the last century, found the legal situation anomalous, a situation unknown to the common law or the civil law or to any system of municipal laws. American Indians were neither citizens nor aliens. They were neither persons nor slaves. They were wards of the nation and yet were little else than prisoners of war, while war did not exist." The sad truth of such a statement is reflected through a well-documented history of American Indian disenfranchisement due to policies of forced assimilation into European American worldview, policies that included religious oppression and mandatory boarding school attendance. Tribal people were alienated from their lands through legal and illegal means, including the usurpation and flooding of tribal lands by the right of eminent domain. 40 years later, American indigenous people faced new forms of theft of lands and resources. In addition to the environmental racism in policies and practices that caused devastating health problems and early death. The Declaration provides a means of international redress that globalizes both indigenous identities and indigenous resistances to such policies by nation states. The ways and means of the resistances vary widely, according to place, state structure, and cultural particularities. Nonetheless, the commonalities of indigenous experience lend strength to each struggle, no matter whether it is in Venezuela, in its efforts to return control of capital to indigenous people, or in the United States, where the struggle continues among Western Shoshone people to reclaim what has unlawfully been taken away from them by, quote, encroachment, which is the argument the lawyers for the government are using for taking away vast amounts of Western Shoshone land and then building these mining operations for gold that destroy the water table. So these issues are across the globe. Quote, "The new Indian wars now take place in the courts and in the lawmaking assemblies where the social infrastructure is built and funded. Educational reform and transformation offers the grounds for rebuilding Native nations and thereby becomes a high priority in claiming the full rights to self-determination." As two Native North American scholars, Marie Batiste, she's Micmac, and James Sake Youngblood Henderson remind us, the military, political, and economic subjugation of indigenous people has been well documented, as have social, cultural, and linguistic pressures and the ensuing damages to indigenous communities. But no force has been more effective in oppressing indigenous knowledge and heritage than the educational system. Transforming our thinking around indigenous issues carries a complex imperative to assure the survival not only of indigenous ideas, but also the survival of the communities from which traditional knowledge is generated and in which it is maintained. The intergenerational historical trauma from displacement, dispossession, oppression, and deracination requires dynamic educational systems and educators committed to making a difference in terms of positive outcomes in tribal people's lives. Indigenous pedagogy also needs to be properly valued. The ways we teach, it's not just what we teach, it's how we teach it. In the words of Gregory Kaheta, Tewa scholar, scientist, and educator, as a whole, traditional tribal education revolved around experiential learning, learning by doing or seeing, storytelling, learning by listening and imagining, ritual ceremony, learning through initiation, and our dreaming, learning through unconscious imagery, tutoring, learning through apprenticeship, and artistic creation, learning through creative synthesis, end quote. While each of those facets of Indigenous ways of knowing is a worthy topic in itself, my focus is on the overall systems of education currently in place and offers a gesture toward the circumstance most likely to make the most productive types of learning possible. I hope you can see this, can you? They're both in the corner, and the little boy says, "I don't know much about history, teach." And the teacher says, "Oddly enough, that may not be your fault." So history to date, they're both in the corner. He because he wasn't taught, her because she didn't teach him. The continuing waves of anti-Indian sentiment in the U.S., along with the vitriolic anti-immigrant response to demographics that project increasing populations of non-white people, make culturally responsive education all the more imperative. The regressive ethnic studies HB 2281 and anti-immigration immigrant law SB 1070 in Arizona stand as prime examples of ignorance on many levels, as well as of fear, xenophobia, and racism on the part of those in political power. Developing educational curricula that teaches the best history we can offer faces obstacles not only at the level of classroom teaching, but also at the administrative levels, where teaching to the test drives assessment and stifles innovation, the No Child Left Behind legacy. So, at this point, I move on to my discussion of Montana. In regard to curricular reform, fostering a bigger picture history, Montana is uniquely positioned to provide an educational model for the other states in its recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights to meaningful representation. The state's constitution, amended in 1972, mandates the dissemination of American Indian history. As you can read above, Article 10, Section 1-2 of the Montana Constitution reads, "The state recognizes the distinct and unique cultural heritage of American Indians and is committed in its educational goals to the preservation of their cultural integrity," end quote. The 1972 Montana Constitution is the only one in the nation that recognizes the unique cultural heritage of Native peoples of Montana and mandates that their history of Native people be taught throughout its educational system, and that schools involve local tribal communities and Native parents in assuring that the spirit of the law is upheld. So it's pretty detailed and extensive. I'll just say in passing that it's been the 20-year anniversary or 20-some-year anniversary is coming up of that convention, and so they're going to have another constitutional convention. And of all the things they're talking about altering or changing or adding to the Constitution, This is staying in. No one's talking about taking it out. We're not having a reactionary political movement that now wants to roll back the clock. And more than that, the school system throughout the state is hip to it. They've changed curricula and it's growing and developing. So it's a very valuable and important movement. Putting teeth to the constitutional mandate has taken many years, however. The Montana legislature passed a Native American Studies Act in order to realize this vision put forth in the Constitution. But after a couple of years, the state teachers brought it down by changing one verb, making Native American studies desired but not required. Some speculate that the original Native American Studies law, meant to fulfill the constitutional mandate, failed to provide a much-needed grandfather clause. The more senior teachers who offered the greatest resistance to the statute needed. After floundering over 2 decades, legislation in 1999, House Bill 528, attempted once again to seek remedy. The American Indian Alaska Native, to remedy the achievement gap of American Indian Alaska Native students. That bill passed and became statute. Since then, the governor has given each tribal college and the landless Little Shell Chippewa people monies to develop histories of their reservations and tribes, and $17 million was given to the Office of Public Instruction to turn those histories into curricula. With the numerous resources provided by the state, 7 essential understandings were developed. I know that's kind of detailed, and I'll sum them up really quickly. They called for understanding that there is great diversity among the 12 tribal nations of Montana, that there is great diversity among individual American Indians as identity is developed, defined, and redefined by entities, organizations, and people, that the ideologies of Native traditional beliefs and spirituality persist into modern-day life as tribal cultures, traditions, and languages are still practiced today, that reservations are lands that have been reserved by the tribes for their own use through treaties, statutes, and executive orders, not given to them, that federal policies put into place throughout American history have affected Indian people and still shape who we are today, that history is a story often related through the subjective experience of the teller. With the inclusion of more and varied voices, histories are being rediscovered and revised. And that under the American legal system, Indian tribes have sovereign powers separate and independent from the federal and state governments. This set of 7 essential understandings was arrived at through incredible gatherings of Native scholars and teachers and brainstorming and all kinds of flip charts up in the room and talking about what do we think are the categories we want. In fact, originally I think they had 8, and then they thought that wasn't a very Indian number. So they brought it down to 7. But it was a powerful movement on the ground to create a consensus about moving education in this direction. In Missoula, an Indian Education for All research project was conducted at a local elementary school. Phyllis Nye, she's a U of M educational doctorate graduate, in collaboration with the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes and the school principal, Karen Allen, created curricula for the students and worked with teachers in their classrooms to deliver the curricula. This is the Lewis and Clark School where we put my son when we first came to Missoula. Nye concludes from her study, quote, students there demonstrated impressive gains in knowledge of Montana tribes. More importantly, she noted, that, quote, roughly twice the students at Lewis and Clark would like to have American Indian friends, to have American Indian teachers, and to help American Indians. Now, isn't that sweet? Compared to students at another school used in this study. I think the people who thought up that lame ethnic studies law in this state ought to think about things like that, that you can make such a marvelous difference by teaching people to have sympathy and empathy for one another and a desire to grow in knowledge and understanding as opposed to labeling and dominating. And children learn that early. They learn a certain social position for themselves, and then they have to unlearn it or else they will become that way when they grow older. So this was a highly successful project. Judging by the seriousness of the achievement gap among Native students, it is difficult to believe that other schools in the state have the positive classroom atmosphere and innovative curricula of Lewis and Clark. I will quickly sum up some statistics from the Office of Public Instruction 2010 report on the Native American achievement gap. While American Indian and Alaska Native students make up 11.8% of the K through 12 school-age population in Montana, they drop out at a rate of 2.5 times that of other students, and they do so predominantly in the 9th grade as opposed to the 12th grade for other students in the state. In other words, a significant number of American Indian Alaska Native students are disenfranchised from the educational system by the age of 15. Some may eventually take the GED, but reliable statistics are not available on that. The number of American Indian Alaska Natives dropouts comprise 53.3%, over half, of the dropouts in Montana. Put in terms of graduation rates, the students graduating from high school in 2009 numbered 10,578. Only 285 of those 10,000 and a half were Native American, which is 2.7%, while Native Americans and Alaska Natives comprise 10% of the students in high school. I should say also that roughly, I think it's around 2.5% of the teachers are Native in the state of Montana. So we have a teacher gap as well as a student achievement gap. And so maybe there's some connection there. As disturbing and particularly for educators in universities and colleges, as disturbing as this is, particularly for educators in university and colleges, we need to contemplate it. Quote, from the graduating class of 2009, 7 American Indian or Alaska Native students earned 3 or higher, and that means, I think it's 3 or 4, those are the categories. So it's only a scale 1 to 4. So 7 students had scores of 3 or higher on at least one advanced placement exam during high school out of 1,066. 7 to 1,066. Those were the number of test takers across Montana. What that means is even of those who graduate from high school. They're not high achievers, or they're not encouraged to be achievers and to go on to college. The educational picture for Native students in Montana makes the difficulties we face in recruiting and retaining Native students at the university level apparent. Yet few educators at such institutions are as aware as they should be of the challenges Native students face on all levels: poverty, social ills, economic woes, and other aspects of the colonial legacy mitigate against the positive efforts of local people in tribal communities dedicated to seeing change and growth. In Montana, the unemployment rate on reservations, depending on the time of the year, can range from 15% to 80%. Can you imagine the social problems that when 80% of any group, if you had a neighborhood in Phoenix that had 80% of the people were unemployed, it's just a staggering social ill. So I'm going to get really positive here in a couple minutes, if you'll just hang on, okay? The tremendously valuable role that tribal colleges make in providing home-based, positive educational experience to tribal people makes a difference in that achievement gap. With their three-pronged mission, cultural revitalization, vocational training, and academic preparation, they fill a crucial gap. About 3 years ago, after an ad hoc university and college committee had been meeting for several years about implementing Indian Ed for All in our institutions of higher education, the Commissioner of Education told us that her legal staff had reviewed the situation and that her office would not approach the legislature or the governor for monies since the law is, quote, ambiguous about the constitutional mandate going beyond K through 12. Several of us then spoke before the legislature, but did not find them open to our efforts to bring Indian Ed for All to higher education either. So, on the University of Montana campus, I worked for 3 years on the General Education Committee in hopes of requiring more courses on subjects that would support Indian Ed for All. But the faculty were not receptive to the idea of either. It has to do with universities are supposed to be a kind of universal set of ideas. And when you have what faculty would call an undue focus on one particular group, it feels like a bias. From a logistical point of view, there were not enough faculty to teach such a course. So it's troubling. It's difficult to move beyond that. So I made the effort to do it, but there was no support to move it forward. So despite the persuasive evidence of its importance, what we do toward fulfilling the constitutional mandate has to fly under the banner of diversity. For that, we have the Minority Achievement Gap state goals. Nonetheless, last year, we completed the first ever system-wide Native American and Indigenous education strategic plans. At the onset, the plan, the Native American portion is supporting students as well as curricula, community connections, and so on. The Indigenous part of the plan is just simply to create, we want to create an Indigenous Studies PhD. We want to have a yearly workshop of some kind and we want to support efforts to have exchanges internationally with other Indigenous people. International programs supports the people who come over from other countries. So the two created a little bit of a political divide for a while, but I think we worked it through. At the onset, we determined that the primary and in some ways unspoken goals should be to increase critical mass of Native students, faculty, and staff, and to ensure that the university do better self-study on all levels, so that we would have statistical evidence of need. We will now be tracking more than incoming freshmen. Up until a couple years ago, we only tracked incoming freshmen. What we know from the current tracking system is that first-time freshman Native American students graduate at half the rate of the other students over 6 years. The process of change is frustratingly low, and at times imperceivable in research institutions, and difficult budgetary times add to the problem. Other features of the strategic plan will serve to empower Indigenous people of Montana in important ways. We will assure that the university policy protecting Indigenous intellectual rights will have procedures developed to go with it. The policy has been on the books for 10 years without procedures. We will diversify curricula to increase teaching about Montana tribes, if that's at all feasible, as well as global Indigenous peoples. When I say if that's feasible, it has to do with the number of faculty that are available to do that. We will account yearly for the grant monies involving tribal people. We will increase awareness of tribal traditions and protocols in what we're calling government-to-government relations, and more items that reflect the rights of Indigenous people all over the world. In the spring of this year, we opened the new Native American Center. The dedication ceremony began with a procession of people walking from the north, symbolically returning to the homelands. The Bitterroot Salish were removed to the north onto the Flathead Reservation against their will and against the understanding of their rights. The Hellgate Treaty was the legal basis for doing that, and if you read the Hellgate Treaty, it was just impossible to know what was truly agreed upon. And there is a transcript that is available, and they had few interpreters of the language. So it's a very questionable legal document, I think. The story is told that they donned their finery for the march. In this picture, what you see, our building has flagpoles that go up there, and representatives from the reservations and from the landless Little Shell came and dedicated their own flags. And after all the flags were flying, then they created the doorway of the tribal nations into the building. So when the people were removed, Chief Charlo instructed them all to dress in their finery, and they did that. And they walked up from the Bitterroot. And as they walked up, they walked across the bridge that goes to the south of the campus. There was a different bridge there across the Clark Fork River. And the women were so protective of Chief Charlo that they surrounded him so that the gawking onlookers couldn't see him cry. It was heartbreaking for the people, totally heartbreaking. when we had our dedication, our procession to the building was led by the Nkusum Salish language school children, followed by all the rest of the people that wanted to come. And it was a proud and hopeful moment. I began with the epigraph in the words of Nicholas Black Elk. The power of his vision carried him through many levels of his life. The holy person gave him, quote, a cane to walk and a people's heart, help and hope for the journey. As we walk toward the new Native American Center, as we occupy it, tell each other jokes and laugh, commiserate about our struggles, we are mapping that world with the hopes and dreams of Indigenous people. Pinamia.